It was a quiet morning in the courthouse. The large marble hall echoed with the soft sounds of shoes tapping against the floor and papers shuffling in the hands of busy clerks. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, falling across the rows of benches where people waited for their cases to be called. Everyone seemed nervous, tired, or impatient, except for one boy who sat quietly in the back row, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes calm but alert. He looked too young to be there. Maybe 17, maybe 18 at most. His suit was slightly too big for him, the sleeves of his jacket brushing against his knuckles when he moved. It looked like something borrowed, maybe from an older relative, but what stood out most was not his clothes. It was the way he carried himself. He didn't fidget, didn't check his phone, didn't whisper to anyone. He just sat there still, like he belonged in that courtroom more than anyone else. When the bailiff called for the next case, people stood and moved aside. A small civil dispute, nothing extraordinary. But when the young man rose from his seat and began walking toward the front, all eyes turned to him. The whispering started immediately. Some people laughed softly, others looked confused. Even the judge raised his eyebrows. The judge, a tall man with silver hair and a deep voice, was known in town for his no-nonsense attitude. He had little patience for delays and even less for jokes. So when the teenager stopped at the defense table and placed a thin folder of papers in front of him, the judge leaned forward with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Son," the judge said, tilting his head slightly, "are you lost? This isn't a school project presentation." The courtroom chuckled. The sound was sharp, echoing off the wooden panels. But the boy didn't look embarrassed. He just looked up at the judge, his face calm. "No, Your Honor," he said softly. "I'm here for the case." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're what, testifying?" "No," the boy said, shaking his head. "I'm representing the defense." For a moment, silence fell across the courtroom. The judge blinked. The court reporter even stopped typing. Then, as if on cue, the room filled with laughter again. One man in the audience actually clapped his hands once, thinking it was a joke. The judge gave a dry chuckle and leaned back in his chair. "That's a good one," he said. "Really, it is. But I don't have time for—" "With all due respect, Your Honor," the teenager interrupted, his voice steady but not rude. "I have authorization to appear today. I'm assisting under the mentorship clause for junior legal aids." He slid a folded document across the table. The judge hesitated, then motioned for the clerk to bring it to him. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. His face shifted slowly from amusement to mild surprise, then to something unreadable. He glanced up at the boy again, then back at the paper. "Well," the judge finally said, "this is certainly unusual." The courtroom murmured again, everyone trying to see what was written on that page. The judge cleared his throat. "It appears you've been approved to assist in this case under supervision," he said slowly. "But still, aren't you a bit young for this?" The boy smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said, "but I'll do my best." The judge stared at him for a long moment, then sighed and gestured toward the bench. "Fine," he said. "Proceed. Let's see what the young man's best looks like." The opposing attorney smirked as he shuffled his papers. He clearly thought this was going to be easy. The audience leaned forward, expecting the teenager to stumble over his words or freeze under pressure. But when he began to speak, the room grew very still. His tone was calm, his sentences clear. He didn't read from his notes, he spoke from understanding. He explained the background of the case in simple, organized language. He used legal terms correctly, but he didn't try to sound fancy. Every word had purpose. Even the judge's pen stopped moving for a second as he listened. At one point, the boy quoted a law clause so precisely that the court reporter glanced at him surprised. It was a section most attorneys had to look up before citing. But the boy recited it effortlessly, like he had memorized every word. The opposing lawyer shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He tried to interrupt once, but the teenager politely pointed to the correct section in the file and asked that he be allowed to finish. The judge nodded in agreement. By the time the boy finished his opening statement, the air in the courtroom had completely changed. The laughter was gone. The smirks were gone. Now there was only quiet curiosity and a little bit of awe. The judge leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. "Well," he said slowly, "that was surprisingly coherent." A few people chuckled, but even they sounded unsure this time. "Thank you, Your Honor. the boy said simply. The judge studied him carefully. You've done this before, haven't you? The boy hesitated. Not exactly in court, he admitted. But I've helped with preparations before. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. And how old are you, son? 17, the boy said. Another wave of murmurs filled the room. 17, some people actually gasped. The judge shook his head and gave a small laugh, though there was no mockery in it now. You're full of surprises, he said. All right then. Let's see how you handle the rest of this. The boy nodded, his face serious again. He quietly gathered his notes and began presenting the evidence. He pointed out inconsistencies in the other side's timeline, flaws in witness statements, and small details that everyone else had missed. His words were careful but confident. Each point landed with clarity. At one moment, when the opposing lawyer tried to dismiss one of his claims, the teenager calmly responded, Your Honor, may I refer to Exhibit C? He walked to the evidence table, lifted the file, and showed that the very document the lawyer was relying on had a date mismatch. The judge leaned forward, squinting, then looked impressed. The judge muttered. That's correct. The courtroom buzzed softly again, this time not from laughter but surprise. Even the senior clerk whispered to another, He's sharp for a kid. As the hearing went on, it became clear that the boy wasn't just parroting information. He understood every word. He knew when to pause, when to press, when to stay silent. There was no arrogance in his tone, just quiet focus. Every now and then, he glanced toward the back of the room where an older man sat in a wheelchair near the exit. The man nodded slowly, his expression filled with pride. No one else seemed to notice. The judge noticed, though. His eyes followed the boy's glance once or twice, as if he was trying to understand the connection. But he said nothing. Finally, after nearly an hour, the judge called for a short break. People started whispering immediately. The opposing lawyer looked uneasy now, flipping through his papers as though trying to find something he'd missed. The bailiff stepped out to make a quick report. The boy, meanwhile, walked over to the side of the courtroom and sat quietly again. His hands trembled slightly now that the tension was easing. But he didn't look nervous, just thoughtful. A woman sitting near him leaned over and whispered, Where did you learn all that? He smiled politely and said, From my dad. She nodded, clearly impressed, but didn't ask more. When the session resumed, the judge's tone had changed. He was no longer mocking. He spoke to the boy as he would to any professional. His questions were sharp, deliberate, meant to test understanding, but each time the boy answered directly without hesitation. At one point, the judge leaned back and said, You know, I've seen seasoned lawyers lose their footing under questioning. You, however, seem unshakable. Why is that? The boy smiled faintly. Maybe because I've already lost a lot more important battles, Your Honor. That answer made the room go quiet again. The judge didn't press further. Something in the boy's tone carried a story no one else knew. By the end of the day, the case wasn't finished yet, but everyone knew this was no ordinary hearing. A teenager had walked into the courtroom and, without raising his voice or showing off, had managed to turn the entire mood upside down. As people left for the day, the judge remained seated for a moment, watching the boy pack his files. There was a thoughtful expression on his face, something between respect and regret. He had mocked the boy when he first walked in, thinking it was a joke. But now he wasn't so sure who had been the fool. Outside, the hallway buzzed with conversation. Reporters began to gather, asking who the young man was. Some people took pictures. The boy didn't seem to notice. He helped the man in the wheelchair down the ramp, holding his briefcase in one hand and the old man's hand in the other. The old man whispered something to him, and the boy smiled quietly. They left the building together, disappearing into the crowd, leaving behind a courtroom that would still be talking about him long after that day. The judge, still sitting in his chambers, finally looked down at the approval letter again. It stated clearly that the boy was assisting under a mentorship clause due to special circumstances. But beneath the formal text, someone had written a small handwritten note at the bottom. He's young, but he's brilliant. Trust him. The judge sighed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Brilliant, he muttered to himself. That's an understatement. And somewhere in the courthouse hallway, the echo of the boy's calm voice still lingered. A reminder that sometimes, wisdom doesn't come with age. It comes with heart. The next morning, the courthouse was busier than usual. Word had spread fast about the young teenager who had stood his ground in court the previous day. Staff members whispered in the hallways, reporters loitered near the front doors, and even a few students from the nearby law college showed up just to see him in person. The judge, sitting in his chambers before the hearing, sipped his coffee slowly. He had read through the case files again late last night, and something about them bothered him. Not because the teenager had done anything wrong, but because the boy's arguments were flawless, more precise than even some seasoned attorneys he had seen over the years. It didn't make sense. How could someone that young have such a strong grasp of legal reasoning? When the bailiff entered and handed over the day's schedule, the judge asked casually, "That boy from yesterday, he's on the list again today, right?" "Yes, Your Honor," the bailiff replied. "Continuation of the case. He's already in the hallway." The judge nodded, pretending not to care, but he did. Something inside him wanted to see how this young man handled another round. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the faint feeling of having underestimated someone. A few minutes later, when the courtroom doors opened, the teenager walked in again. His suit was neatly pressed this time, as though he'd taken extra care. He looked calm, not proud or overconfident, just ready. People turned to look at him the moment he entered. Some smiled, others whispered. But he didn't pay attention. He went straight to his seat, placed his folder on the table, and greeted the clerk politely. The judge entered soon after, and the room fell silent. The teenager stood respectfully as the session began. The opposing lawyer, a middle-aged man known for being sharp and competitive, gave him a cold smile. "Well, young man," the lawyer said lightly, "I hope you're ready for today." "Yesterday was interesting," the teenager nodded. "I'm ready, sir." The judge looked from one to the other, then gave a small nod for the proceedings to begin. The opposing side started presenting their new set of evidence, more documents, more witness statements, and an attempt to strengthen their earlier weak points. The lawyer spoke with confidence, trying to reassert control over the room. But every time he made a claim, the teenager quietly wrote something in his notebook. His pen moved fast but neat, each note written with purpose. When it was finally his turn to speak, he stood and approached the evidence table again. "Your Honor," he began softly, "I'd like to address 3 issues in the statement presented today." The lawyer frowned, crossing his arms. The boy continued calmly. "First, the new witness statement dated last week directly contradicts the original testimony filed 2 months ago. The signature line is identical, but the handwriting differs in key letters. I'd like to request verification." The judge leaned forward, interested. "Do you have proof of that?" "Yes, Your Honor," the boy replied, showing both documents side by side. He had highlighted the small differences, the curve of a letter, the slant of a name. "It's a minor detail, but legally it matters." The judge studied the papers and gave a small nod. "You're right," he said. "That does raise questions." The lawyer shifted in his seat but said nothing. The boy continued. "Second, the financial report used as evidence includes a date that doesn't align with the company's tax record. I checked it last night. The reported expense didn't exist in the fiscal year stated." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You verified that yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor, it's public record." A few people in the audience gasped quietly. Even the court reporter's hands paused for half a second before she resumed typing. The boy wasn't done yet. He turned one more page and said, "And finally, the most important point. The clause used to justify the action taken by the plaintiff was misinterpreted. It applies only to situations involving direct ownership, not partnership." He looked up at the judge, his voice steady. "That difference changes everything." The room fell silent. The judge stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "You're telling me the entire claim stands on a misused clause?" "Yes, Your Honor." The opposing lawyer spoke quickly now, his tone defensive. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. He's not a licensed attorney. He shouldn't be—" But before he could finish, the judge raised his hand. "He's here under court-approved supervision, and he's presenting solid facts. Let him finish." The lawyer fell silent, frustrated. The boy bowed his head slightly in thanks and returned to his seat. The judge's expression was thoughtful. He turned to the clerk. "Verify the handwriting and the tax records. If what he's saying is true, we'll need to reassess." "Yes, Your Honor." As the session moved forward, the judge's attitude toward the boy shifted more and more. What began as curiosity turned into genuine respect. He asked tougher questions, testing him. But each time the boy responded clearly and with evidence to support his reasoning. There was no arrogance, just a quiet confidence that came from hard work and honesty. When the lunch break came, the courtroom buzzed with conversation again. Some people rushed outside to tell reporters what had happened. Others simply stared at the young man as he packed his notes. One reporter managed to approach him before he left. "Excuse me," she said.
"Can I ask how you learned all this?"
"You speak like someone who's been in law school for years." The boy smiled politely. "I just study a lot," he said. "But why law?" she asked. "Most people your age are focused on college or sports." He hesitated for a moment before answering. "My father's a lawyer," he said softly. "He's been ill, so I've been helping him with his work. I guess I learned by watching." The reporter's expression softened. "That's incredible," she said. "You must make him proud." He smiled faintly. "I hope so." The judge, who had been standing nearby talking to the bailiff, overheard part of the conversation. He looked at the boy quietly for a moment, then turned away without saying anything. But deep down, the words stayed with him. After lunch, the hearing resumed. The opposing lawyer came back prepared with more aggressive arguments. He spoke loudly, trying to intimidate, throwing complex terminology into his speech. The judge watched carefully, curious to see how the boy would handle it. When it was his turn again, the teenager didn't raise his voice. He didn't match the lawyer's intensity. Instead, he calmly went through each point one by one, dismantling every argument with evidence and clarity. His tone was respectful but firm. It wasn't about winning, it was about truth. The judge found himself nodding slightly as the boy spoke. It reminded him of his own early days years ago, when he had stood in a courtroom for the first time, nervous but full of purpose. He had long forgotten that feeling, the pure desire to seek justice rather than simply win cases. When the session ended for the day, the judge called both sides to the bench. "We'll continue tomorrow," he said. Then, looking at the boy, he added, "Young man, stay behind for a moment." The courtroom emptied slowly. When it was quiet, the judge looked at the teenager across the room. "You've done something remarkable," he said. "But I have to ask, how much of this case did you prepare yourself?" The boy hesitated. "Most of it, Your Honor. My father guided me through some parts before his health declined." The judge nodded slowly. "I see. Your father must be proud." "He doesn't say much," the boy replied, a faint smile on his face. "But I think he's happy to see me trying." The judge leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "You remind me of myself at your age," he said quietly. "Except I didn't have your discipline. I had the curiosity but not the focus. You, on the other hand, you got something rare." The boy looked down modestly. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge paused, then said, "What's your plan after this case? Will you go to law school?" "Yes, sir," the boy said. "That's the goal. I want to study properly, not just read from home." The judge smiled faintly. "You'll do well," he said. "Just remember, being a lawyer isn't about being clever. It's about being fair. Never forget that." "I won't," the boy said. When he left the room, the judge sat alone for a while, staring at the empty bench. He thought about how easily he had mocked the boy on the first day. It bothered him now, not because of guilt, but because it reminded him how quickly people judge by appearances. That night, as he sat at home reading through old files, he kept thinking about the teenager's words, the calm way he spoke, the accuracy of his evidence. Something about it reignited a spark in him that he hadn't felt in years. A reminder of why he had chosen this profession in the first place. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, the boy sat at a desk covered in papers and law books. His father sat in a chair nearby, weak but smiling faintly. "You handled yourself well today," his father said, his voice rough but warm. The boy looked up, surprised. His father didn't usually comment much. "You think so?" "I know so," his father replied. "That judge won't admit it yet, but he's impressed." I could see it in the way he spoke. The boy smiled softly. "He's tough," he said. "But fair," his father nodded. "That's the kind of man you can learn from. Don't take his mockery personally. Sometimes people test you to see what you're made of." "I understand," the boy said. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the city filling the room. Then his father said, "You've done more than I ever expected. You've given this case a real chance. No matter what happens, I'm proud." The boy didn't answer right away. He just smiled and looked back at his notes, trying to hide the emotion rising in his chest. The next day would be harder. He knew it. But he also knew he wasn't just fighting for a case anymore. He was fighting for his father's legacy, for everything he had learned from watching him work late nights in the same apartment. The sun rose early the next morning, and once again the courthouse filled with people waiting to see the young man who had shaken up the courtroom. The judge took his seat, the lawyers prepared their files, and when the teenager stepped forward once more, there was no laughter this time. There was only silence, curiosity, and a strange sense of respect. And somewhere in that silence the judge found himself almost smiling, ready to see what this young genius would do next. The courtroom was different that morning. The air felt heavier, not because of tension but because of expectation. Everyone knew something important was about to happen. The case that had started as a simple civil dispute had now become the talk of the town. Even people with no connection to it filled the benches, eager to witness the young boy who had turned the court upside down. The judge walked in quietly, his robe flowing behind him. He didn't glance at the audience. His eyes went straight to the defense table. The teenager was already there, flipping through his notes, calm as ever. The older man in the wheelchair was seated behind him again, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth of the room. As the judge took his seat, his gaze lingered on the boy for a moment longer than usual. Then he looked away, picked up his pen, and said, "Let's proceed." The opposing lawyer stood first. He was clearly ready this time, his voice loud and firm. He began laying out his arguments with confidence, trying to re-establish control over the courtroom that had slipped from him in the previous days. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, pacing back and forth, waving documents in the air, emphasizing every point. But as he spoke, the boy just listened quietly, not interrupting once. He made short notes in the margins of his papers, occasionally glancing at the judge or his father. When it was finally his turn, he stood up slowly, collected his documents, and stepped forward. "Your Honor," he began softly, "may I address the statements presented?" The judge nodded. "Go ahead." The boy moved closer to the center of the room, holding one sheet of paper. "The opposing side mentioned a financial transfer made on June 12th, he said, his tone steady. However, according to the record, the company in question was inactive during that period. The signature on the transfer form doesn't match the registered manager's handwriting. He handed the document to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. The lawyer objected immediately. "Your Honor, this is an unverified claim. The defense is trying to create confusion," but the boy cut in gently. "Your Honor, this was verified yesterday evening through the business registry's official database. The confirmation letter is attached behind the copy." The judge looked down, flipped the page, and saw the letter himself. "Well," he said slowly, "he's right." A murmur ran through the courtroom again. People turned to each other, whispering. The opposing lawyer's jaw tightened. The judge motioned for silence and looked at the boy. "You seem very well prepared," he said. "Where did you get access to these records?" "They're public," the boy answered simply. "I stayed late at the public archive office yesterday." The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You went there yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor," the boy said. "I wanted to be sure." The judge leaned back in his chair, studying him again. There was something about this boy that fascinated him. It wasn't just his intelligence, it was the discipline, the quiet determination. Most adults came into court half-prepared, relying on assistants or clerks. But this boy was doing everything himself. The rest of the session continued much like that. Every argument the opposing lawyer made was calmly dismantled with facts and patience. The boy didn't try to humiliate or outsmart anyone. He just spoke with the kind of precision that came from hard study. Halfway through, though, something unexpected happened. The boy was mid-sentence when his father suddenly coughed loudly behind him. It wasn't a normal cough, and it was deep and painful. The courtroom turned as the older man bent forward slightly, struggling to breathe. The boy froze. He looked back instantly, his face pale. The judge immediately gestured to the bailiff. "Get him some water," he said quickly, and a chair closer to the aisle. The boy hurried over, crouching beside his father. "You're okay?" he whispered. His father smiled faintly, his voice hoarse. "I'm fine. Don't stop. Finish what you started." The boy hesitated, torn between staying and continuing. The judge's voice softened. "He'll be all right," he said gently. "You can continue, son." The boy nodded and returned to the center of the room. But his tone had changed now. It wasn't just calm, it carried a quiet fire. Every word he spoke after that came with emotion, with weight. He ended his argument with a simple statement. Your Honor, I'm not here to impress anyone. I just want what's fair. That's what my father taught me, to stand for what's right even when people laugh or doubt you. The judge's hand, which had been resting on his desk, stopped moving. He looked at the boy silently for a few seconds before saying, That's a good lesson. The courtroom adjourned for the day, but nobody left right away. People just sat there, quietly watching the boy help his father out of the room. The older man smiled at the judge as they passed. The judge nodded back, but something in his chest felt heavier than usual. That night, after everyone had gone home, the judge stayed in his chambers longer than usual. The courthouse was dark except for the light from his desk lamp. He opened the case file again but found himself staring not at the legal documents, but at the note attached to the boy's application form. It read, Applicant, special authorization granted for mentorship appearance under supervision. Applicant's guardian gone former attorney, currently on medical leave. The judge exhaled slowly. So that was his father. He remembered the man vaguely, a sharp, honest lawyer who had appeared before him years ago in several cases, always respectful, always prepared. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He could still see the boy's expression in his mind, the way he spoke, the way he stood beside his father, the calmness that didn't waver even under pressure. It reminded him of his own youth, when he too had tried to prove himself in a room full of doubters. The next morning, when the session resumed, the judge's tone was noticeably warmer. He still maintained authority, but the sarcasm was gone. The courtroom atmosphere was quieter, more respectful. Even the opposing lawyer seemed to sense the shift. As the boy began presenting again, the judge found himself genuinely listening, not just to the words, but to the meaning behind them. At one point, during a discussion of legal precedent, the boy referenced a rare case from almost 15 years ago. The judge blinked in surprise. That was his case, one of his early rulings that few remembered. Where did you find that one? He asked, almost amused. The boy smiled faintly. It was in the old law journals at the city library. The logic in your judgment helped me understand how fairness can outweigh technicality. The courtroom fell silent again. The judge looked down at his desk, caught off guard for the first time in years. He cleared his throat and said quietly, I didn't think anyone remembered that one. I did, the boy said softly. It helped me. Something about that moment changed everything. The judge's tone softened completely. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and curiosity, now felt like a place of shared respect. As the day went on, the case took a turn. The boy's detailed arguments began exposing serious flaws in the opponent's evidence, so much so that the judge called for an internal review. The opposing lawyer grew frustrated, trying to regain footing. But the facts were undeniable. By the end of the day, the judge finally set his pen down and said, We'll continue with the closing remarks tomorrow. But before that, I'd like to commend both sides for their preparation, especially the defense. Everyone knew who he was referring to. The boy bowed his head respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. When the session ended, the judge called him over again, just like before. You've done remarkable work, the judge said softly once the room had cleared. Tell me honestly, how long have you been studying law? The boy thought for a moment. Since I was 14, he said. My dad used to bring home case files. I started reading them because I wanted to understand what he did. At first, I didn't get much. But then I started to like it, the judge smiled slightly. 14, huh? Most kids that age don't even like reading. I didn't either, the boy admitted. But when my dad got sick, I had to help him with small things. I learned because I had to. The judge looked down at the papers on his desk. And now you're standing here holding your own in a real courtroom. It's not about me, the boy said quietly. It's about finishing what my dad started. The judge nodded slowly. He understood that feeling, the need to carry someone else's dream forward. He had lost his own father young and had become a lawyer partly to honor his memory. When the boy left the courtroom that evening, the judge sat there for a long time again, staring at the empty room. He realized that this case had become more than just another file in his workload. It was a reminder of what justice really meant. Not paperwork, not procedure, but people. Outside, the boy pushed his father's wheelchair down the courthouse steps carefully. The reporters rushed toward them again, asking questions, flashing cameras. But he didn't stop. He just smiled politely and kept walking. His father's voice broke the silence between them. "You handled yourself well," his father said quietly. "I almost lost focus when you started coughing," the boy admitted. His father chuckled softly. "You didn't, you kept your head. That's what matters." The boy looked at him with quiet affection. "I just don't want to let you down." "You couldn't if you tried," his father said. They reached the bottom of the stairs and paused for a moment. The boy looked up at the courthouse, the same building where his father had once stood tall in front of the same judge. Now it was his turn, and somehow it felt like life had come full circle. The judge, watching from his window above, saw the two figures leaving the building side by side. He stayed there for a long time, his hand resting on the curtain. Then he smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "Genius attorney in disguise." Indeed. But even he didn't realize yet how much further the boy's brilliance, and his heart would take him when the final day of the trial arrived. The next day, the courthouse seemed almost alive with anticipation. People crowded the hallways, whispering and exchanging stories of the teenager who had taken the courtroom by storm. Staff at the front desk recognized some faces from the previous day. A few reporters had arrived early, notebooks and cameras ready, hoping to capture another remarkable display of talent. Students from nearby schools and colleges gathered quietly along the walls, their curiosity bright in their eyes. Inside the courtroom, the judge walked in, his robe swaying with measured steps. His face carried a calm seriousness, but there was something more now. A hint of respect, a trace of curiosity that hadn't been there before. His eyes settled on the young teenager at the defense table. The boy was already there, sitting straight in his chair, folders neatly stacked, his pen ready. He wasn't nervous. If anything, he seemed at peace. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the bustling courtroom around him. The judge took his seat and glanced over the day's schedule. When the bailiff confirmed the next case, he gave a subtle nod. The opposing lawyer, clearly determined to regain control, was standing with a pile of papers under his arm. His expression was sharp, and he carried a sense of urgency in his voice. The moment the lawyer began speaking, the courtroom fell silent. He laid out his points with confidence, pacing slowly and gesturing toward the evidence. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, presenting facts, documents, and witness statements. Every time he tried to assert authority, the teenager just sat quietly, listening, jotting down notes, and occasionally glancing at the judge. Finally, it was the boy's turn to speak. He rose, adjusted his jacket, and approached the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he began in a calm, clear voice, "may I respond to the statements presented?" The judge inclined his head. "Proceed." He moved closer to the evidence table, opening a folder. The opposing side has presented a financial statement dated July 15th. However, upon review, the transfer noted in this document is inconsistent with the official company records. The signature is not consistent with the authorized signatory, and the timeline conflicts with other official filings. He handed the papers to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. The opposing lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is an unverified claim. The defense is attempting to confuse the court." The boy spoke again, his tone polite but firm. "The claim has been verified using the official business registry records. I visited the registry office yesterday evening to ensure accuracy. The documents attached confirmed the inconsistencies." The judge carefully reviewed the papers. After a moment, he looked up. "The claim is valid. This requires verification, but the documents appear correct." A murmur ran through the courtroom. People whispered in astonishment. The opposing lawyer's expression tightened as he realized that the boy's argument was solid. The teenager continued, "Additionally, a witness statement submitted last week contradicts the same witness's earlier testimony. Handwriting analysis shows inconsistencies in signature formation. While minor, this discrepancy raises questions about the credibility of the evidence." The judge leaned forward, studying the documents. "You personally reviewed these records?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the boy replied. "I cross-checked the statements against public archives and previous filings. The inconsistencies were confirmed yesterday evening." The courtroom grew quieter, almost tense. People leaned forward in their seats, trying to catch every word. The opposing lawyer, feeling pressure, fumbled with his papers, trying to counter, but he had no immediate response. The boy then turned to another document. Furthermore, the clause cited in the argument regarding ownership rights has been misinterpreted. The legal precedent clearly differentiates between direct ownership and partnership. The application of this clause to the current situation is not supported by law. Misinterpretation could affect the validity of the claim. The judge raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Very thorough," he said. "It appears you've gone to great lengths to verify all details." The teenager smiled faintly. "I believe it's important to present accurate information, Your Honor." During a brief recess, whispers filled the courtroom. People exchanged impressed glances. A few reporters scribbled notes furiously, while some audience members stared, quietly shaking their heads in disbelief. The young boy had already disproved several key arguments, and he had done so respectfully and calmly, with evidence no one could easily dispute. The judge, alone in his chambers for a moment, reflected on the boy's dedication. He remembered his own first cases when he had felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of responsibility. Yet this boy, barely 17, had not only absorbed complex legal knowledge but applied it practically in a courtroom. The judge couldn't help but admire the discipline and patience. Back in the courtroom, the session resumed. The boy carefully presented the final points of his argument. He highlighted minor errors in procedural documentation, clarified details in the timelines, and referenced past cases accurately. At every turn, he remained composed, respectful, and persuasive. Then, as he was explaining a critical detail, he paused. His gaze went toward the back of the courtroom. His father, sitting in the wheelchair, coughed slightly. It wasn't a severe cough, but it reminded the boy of the stakes. His father's health had been fragile for months, and the boy had promised himself he would not fail. Not now. Not after all the preparation and late-night studying. He swallowed and continued, but his voice carried more weight now, a subtle intensity that drew attention. "Your Honor," he said, "I am not presenting this argument to impress anyone. I am presenting it because I must ensure the facts are clear and justice is served. My father taught me that truth matters more than appearance, more than age, more than recognition." The judge paused, pen in hand. The words were simple, but they resonated in the room. He realized that the boy's motivation went far beyond the courtroom itself. This was personal, deeply human. The boy wasn't seeking accolades. He was carrying a burden of responsibility, honoring his father's work, and protecting the rights of those involved in the case. After the session ended for the day, the judge called the boy to the bench again. "I need to ask," he said quietly, "how much of this preparation did you do yourself?" "Most of it," the boy replied. "My father guided me through some portions, but I reviewed and verified everything. I wanted to be thorough." The judge nodded slowly. "And your father, he's the mentor?" The boy looked at him. "Yes, he was a lawyer, Your Honor. He's been unwell, so I took on this responsibility to assist him and his client." The judge was silent for a moment, thinking. Then he said softly, "I see now why you speak with such confidence and accuracy. You have been trained from home under guidance and through sheer dedication." "That explains much," the boy nodded humbly. "I only hope I've done right by the case and by him." Later, after the courthouse emptied, the judge sat alone in his office. He opened a file he hadn't touched in years, one belonging to the boy's father. Reading through the old documents, he recalled the man's integrity, his meticulous attention to detail, his fairness in every case. The boy was carrying on that legacy, and the judge felt a quiet sense of admiration. At the boy's home, the night was calm, but full of purpose. The father sat in his chair, weak but smiling faintly. The boy, sitting at the desk surrounded by papers and law books, looked up as his father spoke. "You've done more than I could have hoped," he said quietly. The boy shook his head. "I'm just following your example. I'm trying to finish what you started." His father's eyes filled with pride. "You've done well. Remember, it's not just about the law. It's about fairness, honesty, and the courage to speak truth. That is what will make you a real lawyer one day." The boy nodded, understanding fully. He knew the coming days would test him further, but he also knew he had the skills, the knowledge, and most importantly, the determination to succeed. Back at the courthouse, the judge looked at the empty bench and thought about the lessons he had learned in the past 2 days. He realized he had underestimated the teenager at first, assuming youth equaled inexperience. Now he understood that brilliance sometimes hides in the most unexpected places. The boy's knowledge was impressive, but what was even more remarkable was his heart. The motivation behind every argument, every piece of evidence, every careful word. The next day promised to be critical. Both sides would present their final arguments, and the outcome of the case would hinge on precise logic, credibility, and attention to detail. The judge, for the first time in a long while, felt genuinely eager to witness a courtroom performance, not just for the legal arguments, but for the human story unfolding before him. As the boy prepared his notes at home, reviewing each point meticulously, he felt a quiet calm. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about doing right by his father, by the client, and by the law itself. The weight of responsibility rested on his shoulders, but he carried it without complaint. The next day, he would return to the courtroom not just as a teenager, but as a determined advocate, ready to face the final challenge. The judge, observing from his chambers, didn't yet know the full extent of the boy's abilities. But he had a sense that today would be a turning point, not just in the case but in the boy's life and perhaps in his own understanding of what it meant to judge fairly. Outside, the city moved on as usual. Cars passed by. People went about their errands, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding inside the courthouse walls. Yet within those walls, a story of courage, intelligence, and devotion was quietly changing lives, and teaching everyone involved that age and appearance often hide the deepest truths. And so, as the day drew to a close, both the boy and the judge reflected on what had happened so far, one with hope and determination, the other with curiosity and respect, both unaware that the events to come would push their understanding of law, justice, and human potential to an entirely new level. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. The quiet anticipation from the previous days had grown into a palpable tension. Word had spread through the legal community, through reporters and even ordinary citizens who were curious to see the teenager who had upended the courtroom. People arrived early, filling the benches and lining the walls. Some carried notebooks, some cameras, and some just wide-eyed wonder. Inside, the judge took his seat with calm authority, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity he couldn't hide. Over the past few days, he had watched the boy handle arguments with precision, composure, and intelligence far beyond his age. Today, he would watch the teenager face the final test, the culmination of every piece of evidence, every argument, every challenge. The opposing lawyer arrived with a pile of papers in his hands. Clearly determined to regain control, he opened with a confident voice outlining his final argument, trying to re-establish dominance in the courtroom. His words were forceful, his gestures sharp, and his tone commanding. But even as he spoke, the boy sat quietly, writing notes, watching closely, analyzing every point, every pause, every emphasis. When it was the teenager's turn, he rose from his chair. His movements were calm, deliberate. He held his folder close and stepped forward. Voice steady, clear, and precise, Your Honor, he began. I wish to address the final points regarding the evidence and claims presented by the opposing side. The judge, who had spent the last 2 days observing him, now leaned forward, his eyes studying the boy's every movement. He wanted to see not just the intelligence, but the courage, the understanding, the capacity to think quickly under pressure. The boy opened his folder and began presenting systematically. He laid out discrepancies in the timeline, pointing out inconsistencies in witness testimonies. Each observation was supported by documents, dates, and references to previous rulings. He spoke calmly without haste, as if the weight of the courtroom rested lightly on him. Yet every word carried significance, Your Honor, he said, turning to the judge. The financial documents provided contain multiple anomalies. The transfer dated June 12th cannot be verified. The signature does not match the authorized signatory, and the record conflicts with other official filings. He handed the documents to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. The opposing lawyer interrupted sharply. Objection, Your Honor. This is entirely speculative. He is not licensed to practice law. He cannot make these claims. The judge raised a hand. Sit down. Proceed with the evidence, he said quietly but firmly. The boy is allowed under court authorization to present findings. Let him continue. The courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to the teenager. He nodded briefly, acknowledging the interruption, and continued. Additionally, he said, a witness statement submitted last week directly contradicts an earlier statement. The handwriting, while similar in style, shows significant inconsistencies. Verification confirms that both cannot be accurate simultaneously. This discrepancy affects the credibility of the evidence. He looked up at the opposing lawyer calmly. I have attached verification from independent sources to support this point, Your Honor. The judge flipped through the papers carefully, studying the highlighted points. He exhaled slowly, impressed. He realized that the teenager wasn't just repeating facts he had been taught. He understood them deeply and could apply logic in real time. The lawyer tried to push back, speaking louder, waving documents, trying to intimidate. Your Honor, this is manipulation. He is twisting facts to confuse the court. The boy held up a hand, politely but firmly. Your Honor, with all respect, I am presenting the facts as verified through records and independent sources. The integrity of this case depends on accuracy. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He studied the boy, noticing how steady and composed he was even under direct challenge. This wasn't just intelligence. It was discipline, courage, and focus. For the next hour, the courtroom seemed to shrink around them. Every argument was countered, every claim examined, every document scrutinized. The boy worked like a seasoned attorney, systematically dismantling every flaw in the opposition's case while maintaining respect for the court and the people involved. At one point, the judge interrupted, leaning forward. Young man, you have been presenting points very clearly. But let me ask, are you sure about this financial discrepancy? If you are wrong, it could undermine your entire argument. The boy looked up, calm but determined. I am confident, Your Honor. The documents have been verified through multiple independent sources. The error is factual, not interpretative. The judge nodded slowly. I see, very well, continue. The opposing lawyer's face had grown tight. He knew he was losing ground, and his attempts to pressure the boy had no effect. Every interruption was met with a polite, factual response. Every aggressive gesture met with composure. Then, something remarkable happened. The judge asked a series of complex questions, trying to test the boy's understanding of legal precedent, nuanced interpretation, and procedural rules. It was the kind of questioning that seasoned lawyers struggled with, yet the boy answered each one methodically. He referenced cases accurately, explained logic clearly, and even anticipated follow-up questions. The judge's expression softened, betraying a hint of astonishment. At one moment, the boy paused, looked toward his father sitting quietly behind him, and then back at the judge. Your Honor, he said gently, I understand that some of my points may seem unconventional given my age, but I assure you, they are accurate and supported by law. I only seek to present the truth. The judge leaned back, watching the boy intently. He remembered mocking him on the first day, assuming youth meant ignorance. Now he realized how wrong he had been. The boy's brilliance wasn't just academic. It was human, rooted in diligence, respect, and moral responsibility. The session stretched into the afternoon. Witnesses were called, documents examined, and arguments made. But every time the opposition tried to sway the judge with aggressive rhetoric or technical jargon, the boy calmly countered, clarifying errors, pointing out misinterpretations, and demonstrating a deep understanding of the law. Finally, the judge called a pause. Let's take a short recess, he said, his voice quieter than usual. He looked directly at the boy. After this break, we will discuss the resolution of this case. I want to ensure everything is presented accurately before I make a decision. During the recess, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. People speculated about the boy's future. Some said he would be a remarkable lawyer one day. Others marveled at his ability to hold himself with such dignity. The opposing lawyer sat quietly, his confidence shaken, unable to comprehend how a teenager could hold his own so completely. The boy used the break to check on his father. Are you all right? He asked softly. His father nodded, a faint smile on his lips. I'm fine. You're doing everything I hoped you would. Keep going. The boy returned to his seat, taking a deep breath. He knew the final segment of the hearing would be the most critical. This was the moment where evidence, arguments, and character all came together. One mistake, one lapse could undermine everything he had built. When the courtroom reconvened, the judge's tone had changed. He was no longer skeptical or dismissive. He spoke to the boy as he would to a respected colleague, asking pointed questions, testing the logic of every claim. The boy answered each query calmly, providing clarity and evidence. The judge's eyes often widened slightly, betraying his astonishment at the young man's skill.